There is a particular kind of trap that works best when it looks exactly like the thing it is replacing. Not a crude imitation that raises suspicion on close inspection, but a faithful reproduction, something that does everything the original does, that looks identical from the outside, that delivers the promised function with apparent reliability, and that simultaneously does something else entirely, something the person using it would never consent to if they understood what was happening. The most dangerous VPN of all time was this kind of trap. It presented itself as a tool of privacy and security, marketed to exactly the people who had the most reason to want those things: activists, journalists, criminals, intelligence operatives, ordinary people living under authoritarian governments who needed to communicate without being monitored, and it delivered privacy and security to precisely none of them. What it delivered instead, with extraordinary efficiency and over a period of years, was the complete surveillance of its users' internet traffic to the law enforcement and intelligence agencies of multiple governments. It was not a VPN. It was a honeypot of historic proportions, and the story of how it was built, how it operated, and how it was eventually revealed is one of the most extraordinary tales in the history of digital surveillance. The company was called Anom, though it operated within a broader ecosystem of encrypted communication tools that deserve to be understood before Anom itself can be properly appreciated. To understand Anom, you first have to understand the world of encrypted phone networks that preceded it, a world that grew up in the gaps between legitimate telecommunications infrastructure and the needs of criminal organizations that had learned, often through painful experience, that standard mobile phones were surveillance devices that law enforcement could access with relative ease. The encrypted phone market that developed in the 2010s was not primarily oriented toward the mainstream consumer concerned about corporate data collection or government mass surveillance. It was oriented, in significant part, toward organized crime. Companies like EncroChat, Sky Global, and Phantom Secure built and sold specially modified smartphones devices with the camera, microphone, and GPS removed or disabled, running custom encrypted messaging applications, sold through networks of resellers who were often themselves connected to criminal organizations. The selling proposition was simple and compelling: a phone that law enforcement could not intercept, that left no messages on servers that could be subpoenaed, that gave criminal organizations the operational security they needed to conduct their business without the constant threat of their communications being read by investigators. These platforms were genuinely effective for significant periods of time, and their effectiveness enabled criminal activity on a scale that alarmed law enforcement agencies across multiple countries. Drug trafficking networks coordinated shipments across continents. Money laundering operations managed financial flows. Violence was organized and directed. The encrypted phone networks were not peripheral to these criminal enterprises, they were the infrastructure on which the enterprises ran, the nervous systems of criminal organizations that had become sophisticated enough to understand that their greatest operational vulnerability was communication. The takedowns of these platforms, when they came, were remarkable. EncroChat was infiltrated by French and Dutch law enforcement in 2020, producing an intelligence harvest of over 100 million messages that led to thousands of arrests across Europe. Sky Global was disrupted by the FBI and Royal Canadian Mounted Police in 2021. These operations demonstrated that encrypted criminal communication networks, while they provided significant operational security advantages to criminal organizations, were not ultimately impenetrable. But they also created a problem. With the leading platforms compromised or shut down, the criminal market for encrypted communication was disrupted and looking for alternatives. Into this disruption stepped Anom. But Anom did not step into it in the way a legitimate competitor would, by building a better product and competing for market share. Anom stepped into it in a way that is almost cinematic in its audacity. It was built from the beginning as a law enforcement operation, designed by the FBI in cooperation with Australian Federal Police and law enforcement partners in multiple other countries, with a master key built into its encryption architecture from the very start that allowed every message sent through the platform to be read by investigators in real time. Every single message. Not messages that could be obtained through a legal process after the fact. Not communications that required a specific warrant naming a specific target. Every message sent by every user of the platform, automatically, continuously, from the moment the platform launched. The technical architecture of this surveillance capability is worth understanding because it reveals the sophistication of what the FBI had constructed. When a user of Anom sent a message to another Anom user, the message was encrypted in a way that made it unreadable to anyone intercepting it in transit, exactly as the platform's marketing claimed. What the marketing did not disclose was that the encryption system included an additional layer. Every message was simultaneously and invisibly copied and re-encrypted with the FBI's key, then forwarded to an FBI-controlled server before being delivered to the intended recipient. The recipient received their message. The FBI also received their message. From the user's perspective, the system worked exactly as a legitimate encrypted messaging platform would work. From the FBI's perspective, it was a perfect surveillance system, one that required no warrant, no legal process, and no technical attack on the encryption, because the surveillance capability was built into the encryption itself. The deployment of Anom required solving a problem that the FBI could not solve through technical means alone, getting criminal organizations to adopt and trust a platform that was actually built to surveil them. This is where the human intelligence dimension of the operation becomes as interesting as the technical dimension. The FBI worked with a confidential informant who had connections to the criminal networks that used encrypted phones, someone who had the relationships and the credibility to introduce Anom to the market as a trustworthy alternative to the platforms that had been compromised. The informant introduced Anom through existing criminal networks, and the platform spread through word of mouth in exactly the way legitimate encrypted phone platforms had spread, through criminal organizations recommending tools to each other based on their operational security needs. The organic spread of Anom through criminal networks was both the operation's greatest achievement and a reflection of something important about how trust works in criminal ecosystems. Criminal organizations cannot rely on the formal mechanisms of trust, contracts, legal recourse, regulatory oversight, that legitimate businesses use to establish confidence in their suppliers and partners. They rely instead on personal reputation and social network endorsement. A platform recommended by a trusted criminal associate is a platform that can be adopted with reasonable confidence. The FBI understood this and used it. By seeding Anom into the criminal market through trusted intermediaries, they gave the platform the social proof that criminal organizations used as a substitute for due diligence. Over the 3 years that Anom operated, from approximately 2018 to 2021, it accumulated over 12,000 users across more than 100 countries. These were not casual users who downloaded a free app and used it occasionally for benign purposes. They were overwhelmingly serious criminal actors who had specifically sought out a high-security encrypted communications platform because they were conducting operations they did not want law enforcement to know about. Drug trafficking, arms dealing, money laundering, murder for hire, extortion. The full range of serious organized crime, coordinated and planned on a platform that was simultaneously feeding every detail of every plan to law enforcement investigators. The scale of the intelligence harvest that Anom generated over 3 years is almost incomprehensible. Millions of messages. Detailed operational planning for drug shipments involving hundreds of tons of cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and other controlled substances. Financial records showing the movement of criminal proceeds through multiple jurisdictions. Discussions of violence, threats, orders, planning, that allowed law enforcement to intervene and prevent murders that had been arranged on the platform. The investigators who were reading these messages in real time had an intelligence advantage over the criminal organizations using Anom that was, for the duration of the operation, essentially total. They knew what was being planned before it happened. They knew who was involved, where they were, what they were doing, and what they intended to do next. The operation was not without its ethical and legal complications, and these deserve serious attention because they go to fundamental questions about the limits of law enforcement surveillance and the legal frameworks within which government agencies are supposed to operate. The primary legal complication concerned the fact that Anom was used not just by citizens of the United States and Australia, the countries most centrally involved in the operation, but by people in over 100 countries, many of whom were subject to the laws of those countries rather than American or Australian law. The legal authorities under which the FBI was operating were domestic American legal frameworks that did not obviously extend to the surveillance of foreign nationals communicating in foreign countries about activities that might violate foreign laws. Different participating countries handled this problem differently, with some establishing legal frameworks within their own jurisdictions that authorize the collection and use of Anom intelligence for domestic prosecutions, and others relying on intelligence sharing arrangements with the United States and Australia to receive the intelligence and then use it under their own legal processes. The patchwork of legal authorities involved was complex enough that legal scholars have spent significant time since the operation's revelation analyzing whether everything done under the Anom umbrella was lawful under the domestic and international legal frameworks that applied to each participating jurisdiction. There was also the question of what happened to information collected about people who turned out to not be criminal actors, people who, for whatever reason, had ended up with an Anom device but whose communications revealed no criminal activity. The FBI's public statements about the operation emphasized that the targets were serious criminal actors and that the platform was marketed specifically into criminal networks, but the practical reality of any mass surveillance system is that it collects information about people who are not the intended targets as well as people who are. The legal and ethical obligations governing what investigators did with that information are not fully publicly known. The culmination of Operation Trojan Shield, the official name for the Anom operation, came in June 2021, when law enforcement agencies in 17 countries simultaneously executed thousands of search warrants and made hundreds of arrests based on the intelligence gathered through the platform. The numbers were staggering: over 800 arrests in the initial wave, seizures of more than 8 tons of cocaine, 22 tons of cannabis, 2 tons of synthetic drugs, over 250 firearms, and more than $48 million in various currencies and cryptocurrencies. Investigations based on Anom intelligence subsequently produced thousands more arrests and prosecutions across dozens of countries. The operation was immediately recognized as one of the most significant law enforcement actions against organized crime in history, not because of the numbers, impressive as they were, but because of the methodology. For 3 years, the FBI and its partners had not been chasing criminals reactively, responding to crimes after they occurred and working backward to identify perpetrators. They had been watching in real time, collecting intelligence on criminal organizations with a comprehensiveness that had never previously been achieved, and using that intelligence to understand the structure, the personnel, the finances, and the operations of criminal networks at a level of detail that conventional investigative methods could never approach. The criminal organizations that had used Anom were not unsophisticated. Many of them had specifically adopted encrypted communications precisely because they understood the surveillance risks of conventional communications. They had sought out what they believed was a secure platform, had vetted it through their criminal networks, and had used it with confidence for years. The revelation that the platform had been surveilling them throughout was, by multiple accounts of arrested individuals, genuinely shocking. The trust they had placed in the platform was not naive. It was based on the social proof mechanisms that criminal networks use and that the FBI had specifically designed the operation to exploit. The implications of Anom for the broader landscape of encrypted communications are profound and not entirely comfortable, even for people who have no sympathy for the criminal organizations that were caught. The operation demonstrated that a technically sound encryption system can be completely compromised if the entity controlling the encryption infrastructure is itself the surveilling party, that the security of encrypted communications depends not just on the strength of the cryptography but on the trustworthiness of the platform provider. This is not a novel insight in the academic cryptography community, where the concept of the trusted third party and the risks of key escrow and backdoor access have been debated for decades. But Anom demonstrated it at operational scale in a way that made the theoretical concrete. The implications extend beyond criminal networks to the broader question of how any user of an encrypted communications platform can have confidence that the platform is what it claims to be. The answer, which cryptographers have articulated and which Anom illustrates with unusual clarity, is that confidence depends on open source, independently audited cryptographic implementations where the code can be inspected and the absence of backdoors can be verified. Closed source applications, where the encryption implementation is proprietary and cannot be independently audited, require users to trust the platform provider, and as Anom demonstrates, that trust can be misplaced in ways that are invisible to the user. This lesson applies in contexts far beyond organized crime. Journalists protecting sources, political dissidents communicating under authoritarian governments, whistleblowers attempting to expose wrongdoing, ordinary people with legitimate privacy interests, all of them use encrypted communications tools whose security they cannot fully verify independently. The Anom operation was directed at serious criminals and produced outcomes that most people would consider legitimate. But the technical capability it demonstrated, the ability to build a surveillance system into an encrypted communications platform in a way that is invisible to users, does not stay within the moral and legal boundaries of legitimate law enforcement just because it was exercised within those boundaries in one particular operation. The most dangerous VPN of all time was dangerous not because it failed to protect its users, plenty of security tools fail, but because it was specifically designed to appear to protect them while systematically surveilling them, and because it worked perfectly for 3 years before anyone outside law enforcement knew what it was. Its danger was the danger of the perfect trap, indistinguishable from the thing it was impersonating, trusted precisely by the people with the most reason to care about their security, and effective at surveillance in exact proportion to its effectiveness at appearing secure. The criminals who used it are, for the most part, where they belong. The questions it raised about surveillance, trust, and the architecture of digital privacy are questions that do not resolve as cleanly, and that belong to everyone who communicates digitally, which is to say, everyone.